small cane chair up next to the rocker so that she might hold her husband's hand. The raccoon couple sat to your left. Once the presidential party was seated, then the play on stage resumed. John Wilkes Booth rode his horse into a back alley behind the building. Mr. Booth arrived maybe at 9. Upon dismounting, John Wilkes Booth called forth a stagehand, whose name was Edmund Spangler. Mr. Spangler made certain that John Wilkes Booth's horse was held for him outside the rear of the theater for the length of the play. Then John Wilkes Booth opened a back door to your left of the back wall. Immediately upon entering the building, John Wilkes Booth asked permission to be allowed underneath the stage. He opened a trapdoor on this side. He went down a ladder into what is now our museum. Back then, the basement of this building was only partially dug out. It simply had a dirt floor. And another theater employee had to hold an oil lamp so Mr. Booth could see his path. There were no lights under there. John Wilkes Booth traveled under the stage. He came up a ladder and similar trapdoor on the other side, and then he exited. He went out a side door into what was then a covered alley, which back then only led to the street. That alley has been enclosed as a hallway now. You might find this hard to imagine, but there were actually 1,700 audience members in this same space, and they didn't maintain an aisle. They put loose chairs filling the aisles. It was obvious to Mr. Booth he was not going to be able to escape through those crowds after firing a gun within the building. He needed an excuse to have his horse in the back alley. He was willing to risk jumping onto the stage in order to escape. He knew there was no other chance. John Wilkes Booth knew that he needed to wait, so he went into what was then a bar next door called the Star Saloon. There he consumed liquor. Over the course of the next hour, John Wilkes Booth was seen more than one time temporarily exiting the saloon and peering inside the doors here. To all appearances, he was checking on the progress of the play. After 10 p.m., John Wilkes Booth paid his bill at the saloon. Again, he walked onto the street. Being that Mr. Booth was a famous man, he entered without a ticket. He went amongst the crowd up into the first balcony. He slowly started making his way towards President Lincoln's box. There was a gentleman sitting in front of that box. His name was Charles Forbes. Mr. Forbes was simply a White House messenger. He was not part of any security force that guarded Abraham Lincoln. John Wilkes Booth simply handed Mr. Forbes a calling card. And that was the proper custom in the days before the telephone. Mr. Forbes motioned that John Wilkes Booth could enter. There really wasn't much in the way of security for our presidents back then, and they did not create a dedicated security force in response to this crime. There were 2 more presidential assassinations following this, James A. Garfield and then William McKinley. It was only in 1901 that Secret Service obtained its present duties. For those audience members that are seated in a location where they can see that first closed door that Mr. Booth entered, that is the only way in. There is a very small hallway behind that door. And then 2 more doors which both enter to where the president was seated. If I could bring your attention from President Lincoln's box to the box that is located on the other side, you will notice this box has a partition dividing the middle of it. That partition was removed for the benefit of the president so that he might might have access to the whole area, and the divider is leaning against the back wall. The purpose of the hallway is to give each box a private entrance in case the divider were used. The reason this detail becomes important is because Mr. Booth could draw his weapons in that hallway without being observed. The locks on that first door were broken. Some person had taken a pine stick from a broken music stand here at the theater. The stick had been cut down so that one end came to a point, and that stick was left leaning against the wall directly behind that first door. Also, a hole had been carved into the plaster of the wall. John Wilkes Booth picked up the stick. He put one end into the hole and then wedged the other against the door, blocking access after him. It was then that Mr. Booth pulled out the single-shot pistol. With his other hand, he made certain to have a dagger at the ready. On one of the interior doors, a peephole had been carved. John Wilkes Booth was able to spy on where President Lincoln was seated within the box. Mr. Booth waited until a very funny line was performed on stage in Act 3, Scene 2. Really, it was the last big moment of laughter before the play finished. And when the large crowds not only began laughing raucously, but they were clapping and stamping their feet on the wooden floors, John Wilkes Booth used that crowd noise in order to muffle the sounds of the gunshot. He entered one of the doors near President Lincoln. John Wilkes Booth fired the gun at point-blank range. President Lincoln was shot 2 inches behind the left ear and the hair. The bullet probably lodged itself behind the bone of Abraham Lincoln's right eye socket. President Lincoln never spoke after being wounded, and he slumped forward. John Wilkes Booth dropped the gun. Major Rathbone, upon seeing the commotion, he jumped up and made an attempt at grabbing Mr. Booth. Major Rathbone was stabbed in the upper left arm. His wound was serious as well. Then John Wilkes Booth jumped from the box onto the stage. At some point that evening, John Wilkes Booth broke his leg. The famous story goes he broke his leg while jumping, and that is a jump of about 12 feet. But Mr. Booth lived for 12 days after this crime, and he had plenty of time to try to control his image. He was telling different people different things. And another story goes that his horse fell on him later on that day. There was a single actor standing here when Mr. Booth landed. His name was Harry Hawk, but he simply backed away confused. Upon correcting himself, John Wilkes Booth walked very deliberately center stage. He was still wielding the dagger, which he raised over his shoulder. Then he yelled out. John Wilkes Booth almost assuredly yelled a Latin phrase from the stage. The words that John Wilkes Booth yelled were, "Sic semper tyrannis." That's an abbreviation for death to tyrants. It's a reference to the assassination of Julius Caesar. Upon saying those words, John Wilkes Booth fled backstage. He left out of the same door he'd entered much earlier in the evening. Only about a minute of time had elapsed between Mr. Booth pulling the trigger and his exit from here. So Mr. Booth had his back to the audience, and he was beginning to run to the back door when the first screams came from the box. It was the First Lady who yelled, "Stop that man. Will somebody please stop that man?" John Wilkes Booth did slightly injure 2 others in order to exit here, but he was able to get up onto his horse, and at least in the short term, his escape was successful. During John Wilkes Booth's escape, the Confederate government continued to fall apart. On April 18th, the 2nd Confederate Army that was fighting surrendered. John Wilkes Booth made it about 70 miles south of here. The broken leg was greatly hindering his chances of getting away, but Mr. Booth received help. The most important person that helped John Wilkes Booth was named David Harold, but others helped them as well. Members of the 16th New York Cavalry caught up with John Wilkes Booth and David Harold, hiding in a tobacco barn on the Garrett Farm, south of the Rappahannock River, south of Port Royal, Virginia. They surrounded the barn and set fire to it. Mr. Harold surrendered. John Wilkes Booth was shot and killed. John Wilkes Booth's death occurred on April 26th of 1865.